As the evening advanced, and we ascended higher, the snow, which we had beheld whitening the overhanging rocks, now encroached upon our road, and it snowed fast as we entered the village of Les Rouses, where we were threatened by the apparent necessity of passing the night in a bad inn and dirty beds. For from that place there are two roads to Geneva, one by Nyon, in the Swiss territory, where the mountain route is shorter and comparatively easy at that time of the year, when the road is for several leagues covered with snow of an enormous depth. The other road lay 92 through Gex, and was too circuitous and dangerous to be attempted at so late an hour in the day. Our passport, however, was for Gex, and we were told that we could not change its destination. But all these police laws, so severe in themselves, are to be softened by bribery, and this difficulty was at length overcome. We hired 4 horses and 10 men to support the carriage, and departed from Les Rouses at 6 in the evening, when the sun had already far descended, and the snow pelting against the windows of our carriage assisted the coming darkness to deprive us of the view of the Lake of Geneva and the far distant Alps. 93. The prospect around, however, was sufficiently sublime to command our attention. Never was seen more awfully desolate. The trees in these regions are incredibly large, and stand in scattered clumps over the white wilderness. The vast expanse of snow was checkered only by these gigantic pines and the poles that marked our road. No river or rock-encircled lawn relieved the eye, by adding the picturesque to the sublime. The natural silence of that uninhabited desert contrasted strangely with the voices of the men who conducted us, who, with animated tones and gestures, called to one another in a patois composed of French and Italian, creating disturbance, where but for them there was none. 94. To what a different scene are we now arrived, to the warm sunshine and to the humming of sun-loving insects. From the windows of our hotel, we see the lovely lake, blue as the heavens which it reflects, and sparkling with golden beams. The opposite shore is sloping, and covered with vines, which however do not so early in the season add to the beauty of the prospect. Gentlemen's seats are scattered over these banks, behind which rise the various ridges of black mountains, and towering far above, in the midst of its snowy Alps, the majestic Mont Blanc, highest and queen of all. Such is the view reflected by the lake. It is a bright summer scene without any of that sacred solitude and deep seclusion that delighted us at Lucerne. We have not yet found out any very agreeable walks, but you know our attachment to water excursions. We have hired a boat, and every evening at about 6 o'clock we sail on the lake, which is delightful, whether we glide over a glassy surface or are speeded along by a strong wind. The waves of this lake never afflict me with that sickness that deprives me of all enjoyment in a sea voyage. On the contrary, the tossing of our boat raises my spirits and inspires me with unusual hilarity. Twilight here is of short duration, but we at present enjoy the benefit of an increasing moon and seldom return until 10 o'clock, when, as we approach the shore, we are saluted by the delightful scent of flowers and new-mown grass, and the chirp of the grasshoppers, and the song of the evening birds. We do not enter into society here, yet our time passes swiftly and delightfully. We read Latin and Italian during the heats of noon, and when the sun declines, we walk in the garden of the hotel, looking at the rabbits, relieving fallen cockchafers, and watching the motions of a myriad of lizards, who inhabit a southern wall of the garden. You know that we have just escaped from the gloom of winter and of London, and coming to this delightful spot during this divine weather, feel as happy as a new-fledged bird, and hardly care what twig I fly to, so that I may try my new-found wings. A more experienced bird may be more difficult in its choice of a bower, but in my present temper of mind, the budding flowers, the fresh grass of spring, and the happy creatures about me that live and enjoy these pleasures are quite enough to afford me exquisite delight, even though clouds should shut out Mont Blanc from my sight. Adieu. Letter 2. Coligny, Geneva Plainpalais. 1st June. You will perceive from my date that we have changed our residence since my last letter. We now inhabit a little cottage on the opposite shore of the lake, and have exchanged the view of Mont Blanc and her snowy aiguilles for the dark frowning Jura, behind whose range we every evening see the sun sink, and darkness approaches our valley from behind the Alps, which are then tinged by that glowing rose-like 99 hue which is observed in England to attend on the clouds of an autumnal sky when daylight is almost gone. The lake is at our feet, and a little harbor contains our boat, in which we still enjoy our evening excursions on the water. Unfortunately, we do not now enjoy those brilliant skies that hailed us on our first arrival to this country. An almost perpetual rain confines us principally to the house, but when the sun bursts forth, it is with a splendor and heat unknown in England. The thunderstorms that visit us are grander and more terrific than I have ever seen before. We watch them as they approach from the opposite side of the lake, observing the lightning 100 play among the clouds in various parts of the heavens, and dart in jagged figures upon the piny heights of Jura, dark with the shadow of the overhanging cloud, while perhaps the sun is shining cheerily upon us. One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines on Jura made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an instant, when a pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads amid the darkness. But while I still dwell on the country around Geneva, you will expect me to say something of the town itself. There is nothing, however, in it that can 101 repay you for the trouble of walking over its rough stones. The houses are high, the streets narrow, many of them on the ascent, and no public building of any beauty to attract your eye, or any architecture to gratify your taste. The town is surrounded by a wall, the three gates of which are shut exactly at 10 o'clock, when no bribery, as in France, can open them. To the south of the town is the promenade of the Genevese, a grassy plain planted with a few trees and called Plainpalais. Here a small obelisk is erected to the glory of Rousseau. And here, such is the mutability of human life, the magistrates, the successors of those who exiled him from his native country, 102 were shot by the populace during that revolution which his writings mainly contributed to mature, and which, notwithstanding the temporary bloodshed and injustice with which it was polluted, has produced enduring benefits to mankind, which all the chicanery of statesmen, nor even the great conspiracy of kings, can entirely render vain. From respect to the memory of their predecessors, none of the present magistrates ever walk in Plainpalais. Another Sunday recreation for the citizens is an excursion to the top of Mont Salve. This hill is within a league of the town, and rises perpendicularly from the cultivated plain. It is ascended on the other side, and I shall judge from its situation that your toil is rewarded by a delightful view of the course of the Rhone and Arve, and of the shores of the lake. We have not yet visited it. There is more equality of classes here than in England. This occasions a greater freedom and refinement of manners among the lower orders than we meet with in our own country. I fancy the haughty English ladies are greatly disgusted with this consequence of republican institutions, for the Genevese servants complain very much of their scolding, an exercise of the tongue, I believe, perfectly unknown here. The peasants of Switzerland may not, however, emulate the vivacity 104 and grace of the French. They are more cleanly, but they are slow and inapt. I know a girl of 20, who, although she had lived all her life among vineyards, could not inform me during what month the vintage took place, and I discovered she was utterly ignorant of the order in which the months succeed to one another. She would not have been surprised if I had talked of the burning sun and delicious fruits of December, or of the frosts of July. Yet she is by no means deficient in understanding. The Genevese are also much inclined to Puritanism. It is true that from habit they dance on a Sunday, but as soon as the French government was 105 abolished in the town, the magistrates ordered the theater to be closed, and measures were taken to pull down the building. We have latterly enjoyed fine weather, and nothing is more pleasant than to listen to the evening song of the vine dressers. They are all women, and most of them have harmonious although masculine voices. The theme of their ballads consists of shepherds, love, flocks, and the sons of kings who fall in love with beautiful shepherdesses. Their tunes are monotonous, but it is sweet to hear them in the stillness of evening, while we are enjoying the sight of the setting sun, either Froth Hill behind our house or from the lake. Such are our pleasures here, which would be greatly increased if the season had been more favorable, for they chiefly consist in such enjoyments as sunshine and gentle breezes bestow. We have not yet made any excursion in the environs of the town, but we have planned several, when you shall again hear of us. And we will endeavor, by the magic of words, to transport the ethereal part of you to the neighborhood of the Alps and mountain streams and forests, which, while they clothe the former, darken the latter with their vast shadows. Adieu. Letter 3. To T.P.S. Melterie Clarenchillen Vevey Lausanne. Montélimar near Coligny, Geneva. July 12th. It is nearly a fortnight since I have returned from Vevey. This journey has been on every account delightful, but most especially because then I first knew the divine beauty of Rousseau's imagination as it exhibits itself in Julie. It is inconceivable what an enchantment the scene itself lends to those delineations, from which its own 108 most touching charm arises. But I will give you an abstract of our voyage, which lasted 8 days, And if you have a map of Switzerland, you can follow me. We left Montélimar at 2:30 on the 23rd of June. The lake was calm, and after 3 hours of rowing we arrived at Hermance, a beautiful little village containing a ruined tower built, the villagers say, by Julius Caesar. There were three other towers similar to it, which the Genoese destroyed for their own fortifications in 1560. We got into the tower by a kind of window. The walls are immensely solid, and the stone of which it is built so hard that it yet retaineth mark of chisels. The boatman said that this tower was once 3 times higher than it is now. There are two staircases in the thickness of the walls, one of which is entirely demolished, and the other half ruined, and only accessible by a ladder. The town itself, now an inconsiderable village inhabited by a few fishermen, was built by a queen of Burgundy, and reduced to its present state by the inhabitants of Bern, who burnt and ravaged everything they could find. Leaving Hermance, we arrived at sunset at the village of Nerney. After looking at our lodgings, which were gloomy and dirty, we walked out by the side of the lake. It was beautiful to see the vast expanse of these purple and misty waters broken by the craggy islets near to its slant and beached margin. There were many fish sporting in the lake, and multitudes were collected close to the rocks to catch the flies which inhabited them. On returning to the village, we sat on a wall beside the lake, looking at some children who were playing at a game like ninepins. The children here appeared in an extraordinary way deformed and diseased. Most of them were crooked, and with enlarged throats, but one little boy had such exquisite grace in his mien and motions, as I never before saw equaled in a child. His countenance was 111 beautiful for the expression with which it overflowed. There was a mixture of pride and gentleness in his eyes and lips, the indications of sensibility, which his education will probably pervert to misery or seduce to crime. But there was more of gentleness than of pride, and it seemed that the pride was tamed from its original wildness by the habitual exercise of milder feelings. My companion gave him a piece of money, which he took without speaking, with a sweet smile of easy thankfulness, and then with an unembarrassed air turned to his play. All this might scarcely be, but the imagination surely could not forbear to breathe into the most inanimate forms some likeness 112 of its own visions, on such a serene and glowing evening, in this remote and romantic village, beside the calm lake that bore us hither. On returning to our inn, we found that the servant had arranged our rooms, and deprived them of the greater portion of their former disconsolate appearance. They reminded my companion of Greece. It was 5 years, he said, since he had slept in such beds. The influence of the recollections excited by this circumstance on our conversation gradually faded, and I retired to rest with no unpleasant sensations, thinking of our journey tomorrow, and of the pleasure of recounting the little adventures of it when we return. 113 The next morning we passed Ivoire, a scattered village with an ancient castle, whose houses are interspersed with trees, and which stands at a little distance from Nerney, on the promontory which bounds a deep bay, some miles in extent. So soon as we arrived at this promontory, the lake began to assume an aspect of wilder magnificence. The mountains of Savoy, whose summits were bright with snow, descended in broken slopes to the lake. On high, the rocks were dark with pine forests which become deeper and more immense, until the ice and snow mingle with the points of naked rock that pierce the blue air. But below, groves of walnut, chestnut, and oak, with 114 openings of lawny fields, attested the milder climate. As soon as we had passed the opposite promontory, we saw the river Drance, which descends from between a chasm in the mountains, and makes a plain near the lake, intersected by its divided streams. Thousands of bisolites, beautiful water birds like seagulls, but smaller, with purple on their backs, take their station on the shallows, where its waters mingle with the lake. As we approached Evian, the mountains descended more precipitously to the lake, and masses of intermingled wood and rock overhung its shining spire. We arrived at this town about 7 o'clock, after a day which involved more rapid changes of atmosphere than I ever recollect to have observed before. The morning was cold and wet, then an easterly wind and the clouds hard and high, then thunder showers and wind shifting to every quarter, then a warm blast from the south and summer clouds hanging over the peaks, with bright blue sky between. About half an hour after we had arrived at Evian, a few flashes of lightning came from a dark cloud, directly overhead, and continued after the cloud had dispersed. Despiter purpura tenantes egit equos, a phenomenon which certainly had no influence on me, corresponding with that which it produced on Horace. 116. The appearance of the inhabitants of Evian is more wretched, diseased, and poor than I ever recollect to have seen. The contrast indeed between the subjects of the King of Sardinia and the citizens of the independent republics of Switzerland, affords a powerful illustration of the blighting mischiefs of despotism within the space of a few miles. They have mineral waters here, eau savenuses they call them. In the evening we had some difficulty about our passports, but so soon as the syndic heard my companion's rank and name, he apologized for the circumstance. The inn was good. During our voyage, on the distant height of a hill, covered with pine forests, we saw a ruined castle, which reminded me of those on the Rhine. We left Evian on the following morning, with a wind of such violence as to permit but one sail to be carried. The waves also were exceedingly high, and our boat so heavily laden that there appeared to be some danger. We arrived, however, safe at Mellery, after passing with great speed mighty forests which overhung the lake, and lawns of exquisite verdure, and mountains with bare and icy points, which rose immediately from the summit of the rocks, whose bases were echoing to the waves. We here heard that the Empress Maria Louisa had slept at Mellery, 118 before the present inn was built, and when the accommodations were those of the most wretched village, in remembrance of St. Priya. How beautiful it is to find that the common sentiments of human nature can attach themselves to those who are the most removed from its duties and its enjoyments. When genius pleads for their admission at the gate of power, to own them was becoming in the Empress, and confirms the affectionate praise contained in the regret of a great and enlightened nation. A Bourbon dared not even to have remembered Rousseau. She owed this power to that democracy which her husband's dynasty outraged, and of which it was 119, however, in some sort the representative among the nations of the earth. This little incident shows at once how unfit and how impossible it is for the ancient system of opinions, or for any power built upon a conspiracy to revive them, permanently to subsist among mankind. We dined there and had some honey, the best I have ever tasted, the very essence of the mountain flowers, and as fragrant. Probably the village derives its name from this production. Mellery is the well-known scene of St. Pria's visionary exile, but Mellery is indeed enchanted ground, were Rousseau no magician. Groves of pine, chestnut, and walnut overshadow it, magnificent and unbounded forests to 120 which England affords no parallel. In the midst of these woods are dells of lawny expanse, inconceivably verdant, adorned with 1,000 of the rarest flowers and odorous with thyme. The lake appeared somewhat calmer as we left Mellery, sailing close to the banks, whose magnificence augmented with the turn of every promontory. But we congratulated ourselves too soon. The wind gradually increased in violence until it blew tremendously, and as it came from the remotest extremity of the lake, produced waves of a frightful height and covered the whole surface with a chaos of foam. One of our boatmen, who was a dreadfully stupid fellow, persisted in holding the 121 sail at a time when the boat was on the point of being driven under water by the hurricane. On discovering his error, he let it entirely go, and the boat for a moment refused to obey the helm. In addition, the rudder was so broken as to render the management of it very difficult. One wave fell in, and then another. My companion, an excellent swimmer, took off his coat, I did the same, and we sat with our arms crossed, every instant expecting to be swamped. The sail was however again held, the boat obeyed the helm, and still in imminent peril from the immensity of the waves, we arrived in a few minutes at a sheltered port in the village of St. Jingui felt in this near prospect of death a mixture of sensations, among which terror entered, though but subordinately. My feelings would have been less painful had I been alone, but I know that my companion would have attempted to save me, and I was overcome with humiliation when I thought that his life might have been risked to preserve mine. When we arrived at St. Jingu, the inhabitants who stood on the shore, unaccustomed to see a vessel as frail as ours, and fearing to venture at all on such a sea, exchanged looks of wonder and congratulation with our boatmen, who, as well as ourselves, were well pleased to set foot on shore. St. Jingu is even more beautiful than Mellery. The mountains are higher, and their loftiest points of elevation descend more abruptly to the lake. On high, the aerial summits still cherish great depths of snow in their ravines and in the paths of their unseen torrents. One of the highest of these is called Roche de Saint Julien, beneath whose pinnacles the forests become deeper and more extensive. The chestnut gives a peculiarity to the scene, which is most beautiful, and will make a picture in my memory, distinct from all other mountain scenes which I have ever before visited. As we arrived here early, we took a voyage to visit the mouth of the Rhone. We went between the mountains and the lake, under groves of mighty chestnut trees, beside perpetual streams, which are nourished by the snows above and form stalactites on the rocks over which they fall. We saw an immense chestnut tree, which had been overthrown by the hurricane of the morning. The place where the Rhone joins the lake was marked by a line of tremendous breakers. The river is as rapid as when it leaves the lake, but is muddy and dark. We went about a league farther on the road to La Vallée and stopped at a castle called La Tour de Bouverie, which seems to be the frontier of Switzerland and Savoy, as we were asked for our passports, on the supposition of our proceeding to Italy. 125 on one side of the road was the immense Roche de Saint Julien which overhung it. Through the gateway of the castle we saw the snowy mountains of La Vallée, clothed in clouds, and on the other side was the willowy plain of the Rhône, in a character of striking contrast with the rest of the scene, bounded by the dark mountains that overhang Clarens, Vevey, and the lake that rolls between. In the midst of the plain rises a little isolated hill, on which the white spire of a church peeps from among the tufted chestnut woods. We returned to St. Jingu before sunset, and I passed the evening in reading Julie. 126. As my companion rises late, I had time before breakfast, on the ensuing morning, to hunt the waterfalls of the river that fall into the lake at St. Jingu. The stream is indeed, from the declivity over which it falls, only a succession of waterfalls, which roar over the rocks with a perpetual sound, and suspend their unceasing spray on the leaves and flowers that overhang and adorn its savage banks. The path that conducted along this river sometimes avoided the precipices of its shores, by leading through meadows, sometimes threaded the base of the perpendicular and caverned rocks. I gathered in these meadows a nosegay of 127 such flowers as I never saw in England, and which I thought more beautiful for that rarity. On my return after breakfast, we sailed for Clarens, determining first to see the three mouths of the Rhône, and then the castle of Chillon. The day was fine and the water calm. We passed from the blue waters of the lake over the stream of the Rhône, which is rapid even at a great distance from its confluence with the lake. The turbid waters mixed with those of the lake, but mixed with them unwillingly. See Nouvelle Héloïse, Letter 17, Part 4. I read Julie all day, and overflowing, as it now seems, surrounded by the scenes which it has so wonderfully peopled, 128 of sublimest genius, and more than human sensibility. Mellery, the castle of Chillon, Clarens, the mountains of La Vallée and Savoy, present themselves to the imagination as monuments of things that were once familiar, and of beings that were once dear to it. They were created indeed by one mind, but a mind so powerfully bright as to cast a shade of falsehood on the records that are called reality. We passed on to the castle of Chillon, and visited its dungeons and towers. These prisons are excavated below the lake. The principal dungeon is supported by 7 columns, whose branching capitals support the roof. Close to the very walls, the lake is 129 feet deep. Iron rings are fastened to these columns, and on them were engraven a multitude of names, partly those of visitors, and partly doubtless of the prisoners, of whom now no memory remains, and who thus beguiled a solitude which they have long ceased to feel. One date was as ancient as 1670. At the commencement of the Reformation, and indeed long after that period, this dungeon was the receptacle of those who shook, or who denied the system of idolatry, from the effects of which mankind is even now slowly emerging. Close to this long and lofty dungeon was a narrow cell, and beyond it one larger and far more lofty and dark, supported upon 2 unornamented arches. Across one of these arches was a beam, now black and rotten, on which prisoners were hung in secret. I never saw a monument more terrible of that cold and inhuman tyranny, which it has been the delight of man to exercise over man. It was indeed one of those many tremendous fulfillments which render the pernices humani generis of the great Tacitus so solemn and irrefragable a prophecy. The gendarme, who conducted us over this castle, told us that there was an opening to the lake, by means of a secret spring, connected with which the whole dungeon might be filled with water before the prisoners could possibly escape. 131 We proceeded with a contrary wind to Clarens, against a heavy swell. I never felt more strongly than on landing at Clarens that the spirit of old times had deserted its once cherished habitation. 1,000 times, thought I, have Julia and St. Priya walked on this terraced road, looking towards these mountains which I now behold, nay, treading on the ground where I now tread. From the window of our lodging, our landlady pointed out Le Bosque de Julie. At least the inhabitants of this village are impressed with an idea that the persons of that romance had actual existence. In the evening we walked thither. It is indeed Julia's wood. The hay was making 132 under the trees. The trees themselves were aged, but vigorous and interspersed with younger ones, which are destined to be their successors, and in future years, when we are dead, to afford a shade to future worshippers of nature, who love the memory of that tenderness and peace of which this was the imaginary abode. We walked forward among the vineyards, whose narrow terraces overlook this affecting scene. Why did the cold maxims of the world compel me at this moment to repress the tears of melancholy transport, which it would have been so sweet to indulge, immeasurably, even until the darkness of night had swallowed up the objects which excited them? 133. I forgot to remark, what indeed my companion remarked to me, that our danger from the storm took place precisely in the spot where Julie and her lover were nearly overset, and where Saint Priya was tempted to plunge with her into the lake. On the following day we went to see the castle of Clarens, a square strong house, with very few windows, surrounded by a double terrace that overlooks the valley, or rather the plain of Clarens. The road which conducted to it wound up the steep ascent through woods of walnut and chestnut. We gathered roses on the terrace, in the feeling that they might be the posterity of some planted by Julia's hand. We 134 sent their dead and withered leaves to the absent. We went again to the Bosque de Julie, and found that the precise spot was now utterly obliterated, and a heap of stones marked the place where the little chapel had once stood. Whilst we were execrating the author of this brutal folly, our guide informed us that the land belonged to the convent of St. Bernard, and that this outrage had been committed by their orders. I knew before that if avarice could harden the hearts of men, a system of prescriptive religion has an influence far more inimical to natural sensibility. I know that an isolated man is sometimes restrained by shame from outraging the 135 venerable feelings arising out of the memory of genius, which once made nature even lovelier than itself. But associated man holds it as the very sacrament of his union to forswear all delicacy, all benevolence, all remorse, all that is true, or tender, or sublime. We sailed from Clarens to Vevey. Vevey is a town more beautiful in its simplicity than any I have ever seen. Its marketplace, a spacious square interspersed with trees, looks directly upon the mountains of Savoy and La Vallée, the lake, and the valley of the Rhône. It was at Vevey that Rousseau conceived the design of Julie. From Vevey we came to Ouchy, a village near Lausanne. The coasts of 136, the Pays de Vaud, though full of villages and vineyards, present an aspect of tranquility and peculiar beauty, which well compensates for the solitude which I am accustomed to admire. The hills are very high and rocky, crowned and interspersed with woods. Waterfalls echo from the cliffs and shine afar. In one place we saw the traces of two rocks of immense size, which had fallen from the mountain behind. One of these lodged in a room where a young woman was sleeping, without injuring her. The vineyards were utterly destroyed in its path, and the earth torn up. The rain detained us 2 days at Ouchy. We however visited Lausanne, 137, and saw Gibbon's house. We were shewn the decayed summer house where he finished his history, and the old acacias on the terrace, from which he saw Mont Blanc, after having writ the last sentence. There is something grand and even touching in the regret which he expresses at the completion of his task. It was conceived amid the ruins of the capital. The sudden departure of his cherished and accustomed toil must have left him, like the death of a dear friend, sad and solitary. My companion gathered some acacia leaves to preserve in remembrance of him. I refrained from doing so, fearing to outrage the greater and more 138 sacred name of Rousseau, the contemplation of whose imperishable creations had left no vacancy in my heart for mortal things. Gibbon had a cold and unimpassioned spirit. I never felt more inclination to rail at the prejudices which cling to such a thing, than now that Julie and Clarens, Lausanne and the Roman Empire, compelled me to a contrast between Rousseau and Gibbon. When we returned, in the only interval of sunshine during the day, I walked on the pier which the lake was lashing with its waves. A rainbow spanned the lake, or rather rested one extremity of its arch upon the water, and the other at the foot of the mountains 139 of Savoy. Some white houses, I know not if they were those of Mellery, shone through the yellow fire. On Saturday the 30th of June, we quitted Ouchy, and after 2 days of pleasant sailing, arrived on Sunday evening at Montélimar. Nice. Letter 4. To T.P.S. St. Martin-Servoz, Chamonix, Montenvert, Mont Blanc. Hôtel de Londres, Chamonix. July 22 d. 1816. Whilst you, my friend, are engaged in securing a home for us, we are wandering in search of recollections to embellish it. I do not err in conceiving that you are interested in details of all that is majestic or beautiful in nature. But how shall I describe to you the scenes by which I am now surrounded? To exhaust the epithets which express 141 the astonishment and the admiration, the very excess of satisfied astonishment, where expectations scarcely acknowledged any boundary, Is this, to impress upon your mind the images which fill mine now, even till it overflow? I too have read the raptures of travelers. I will be warned by their example. I will simply detail to you all that I can relate, or all that, if related, would enable you to conceive of what we have done or seen since the morning of the 20th, when we left Geneva. We commenced our intended journey to Chamonix at 8:30 in the morning. We passed through the Champagne country, which extends 142 from Mont Salve to the base of the higher Alps. The country is sufficiently fertile, covered with cornfields and orchards, and intersected by sudden acclivities with flat summits. The day was cloudless and excessively hot, the Alps were perpetually in sight, and as we advanced, the mountains, which form their outskirts, closed in around us. We passed a bridge over a stream which discharges itself into the Arve. The Arve itself, much swollen by the rains, flows constantly to the right of the road. As we approached Bonneville through an avenue composed of a beautiful species of drooping poplar, we observed that the cornfields on each side 143 were covered with inundation. Bonneville is a neat little town, with no conspicuous peculiarity, except the white towers of the prison, an extensive building overlooking the town. At Bonneville the Alps commence, one of which, clothed by forests, rises almost immediately from the opposite bank of the Arve. From Bonneville to Clusses, the road conducts through a spacious and fertile plain, surrounded on all sides by mountains, covered like those of Mellerie, with forests of intermingled pine and chestnut. At Clusses the road turns suddenly to the right, following the Arve along the chasm, which it seems to have hollowed for itself among the 144 perpendicular mountains. The scene assumes here a more savage and colossal character. The valley becomes narrow, affording no more space than is sufficient for the river and the road. The pines descend to the banks, imitating with their irregular spires the pyramidal crags which lift themselves far above the regions of forest into the deep azure of the sky, and among the white dazzling clouds. The scene, at the distance of half a mile from Clusses, differs from that of Matlock in little else than in the immensity of its proportions, and in its untamable, inaccessible solitude, inhabited only by the goats which we saw browsing on the rocks. 145 near Maglins, within a league of each other, we saw two waterfalls. They were no more than mountain rivulets, but the height from which they fell, at least of 1,200 feet, made them assume a character inconsistent with the smallness of their stream. The first fell from the overhanging brow of a black precipice on an enormous rock, precisely resembling some colossal Egyptian statue of a female deity. It struck the head of the visionary image and, gracefully dividing there, fell from it in folds of foam more like to cloud than water, imitating a veil of the most exquisite woof. It then united, concealing the lower part of the statue, and hiding itself in 146a winding of its channel, burst into a deeper fall, and crossed our route in its path towards the Arve. The other waterfall was more continuous and larger. The violence with which it fell made it look more like some shape which an exhalation had assumed, than like water, for it streamed beyond the mountain, which appeared dark behind it, as it might have appeared behind an evanescent cloud. The character of the scenery continued the same until we arrived at St. Martin, called in the map Sallanches, the mountains perpetually becoming more elevated, exhibiting at every turn of the road more craggy summits, loftier and wider extent of forests, darker and more deep recesses. 147. The following morning we proceeded from St. Martin on mules to Chamonix, accompanied by two guides. We proceeded, as we had done the preceding day, along the valley of the Arve, a valley surrounded on all sides by immense mountains, whose rugged precipices are intermixed on high with dazzling snow. Their bases were still covered with the eternal forests, which perpetually grew darker and more profound as we approached the inner regions of the mountains. On arriving at a small village at the distance of a league from St. Martin, we dismounted from our mules and were conducted by our guides to view a cascade. We beheld an immense 148 body of water fall 250 feet, dashing from rock to rock, and casting a spray which formed a mist around it, in the midst of which hung a multitude of sunbows, which faded or became unspeakably vivid, as the inconstant sun shone through the clouds. When we approached near to it, the rain of the spray reached us, and our clothes were wetted by the quick-falling but minute particles of water. The cataract fell from above into a deep craggy chasm at our feet, where, changing its character to that of a mountain stream, it pursued its course towards the Arve, roaring over the rocks that impeded its progress. As we proceeded, our route still lay 149 through the valley, or rather, as it had now become, the vast ravine, which is at once the couch and the creation of the terrible Arve. We ascended, winding between mountains whose immensity staggers the imagination. We crossed the path of a torrent, which 3 days since had descended from the thawing snow and torn the road away. We dined at Servaz, a little village, where there are lead and copper mines, and where we saw a cabinet of natural curiosities, like those of Keswick and Bethgelert. We saw in this cabinet some chamois horns, and the horns of an exceedingly rare animal called the bauquetin, which inhabits the Desarts 150 of snow to the south of Mont Blanc. It is an animal of the stag kind. Its horns weigh at least 27 English pounds. It is inconceivable how so small an animal could support so inordinate a weight. The horns are of a very peculiar conformation, being broad, massy, and pointed at the ends, and surrounded with a number of rings, which are supposed to afford an indication of its age. There were 17 rings on the largest of these horns. From Servaz, 3 leagues remained to Chamonix. Mont Blanc was before us, the Alps, with their innumerable glaciers on high all around, closing in the complicated windings of the 151 single vale, forests inexpressibly beautiful, but majestic in their beauty, intermingled beech and pine, and oak overshadowed our road or receded, whilst lawns of such verdure as I have never seen before occupied these openings and gradually became darker in their recesses. Mont Blanc was before us, but it was covered with cloud, its base, furrowed with dreadful gaps, was seen above. Pinnacles of snow, intolerably bright, part of the chain connected with Mont Blanc, shone through the clouds at intervals on high. I never imagined what mountains were before. The immensity of these aerial summits excited, when they suddenly burst upon the 152 sight, a sentiment of ecstatic wonder, not unallied to madness. And remember, this was all one scene. It all pressed home to our regard and our imagination. Though it embraced a vast extent of space, the snowy pyramids which shot into the bright blue sky seemed to overhang our path. The ravine, clothed with gigantic pines, and black with its depth below, so deep that the very roaring of the untamable Arve, which rolled through it, could not be heard above. All was as much our own, as if we had been the creators of such impressions in the minds of others as now occupied our own. Nature was the poet, whose harmony held our spirits more breathless than that of the divinest. 153, as we entered the valley of Chamonix, which in fact may be considered as a continuation of those which we have followed from Bonneville and Clusses. Clouds hung upon the mountains at the distance perhaps of 6,000 feet from the earth, but so as effectually to conceal not only Mont Blanc, but the other aiguilles, as they call them here, attached and subordinate to it. We were traveling along the valley, when suddenly we heard a sound as of the burst of smothered thunder rolling above. Yet there was something earthly in the sound that told us it could not be thunder. Our guide hastily pointed out to us a part of the mountain opposite, from whence the sound came. It was an avalanche. We saw the smoke of its path among the rocks, and continued to hear at intervals the bursting of its fall. It fell on the bed of a torrent, which it displaced, and presently we saw its tawny-colored waters also spread themselves over the ravine, which was their couch. We did not, as we intended, visit the Glacier de Boisson today, although it descends within a few minutes' walk of the road, wishing to survey it at least when unfatigued. We saw this glacier which comes close to the fertile plain. As we passed, its surface was broken into 1,000 unaccountable figures. Conical and pyramidical crystallizations, more than 50 feet in height, rise from its surface, and precipices of ice, of dazzling splendor, overhang the woods and meadows of the vale. This glacier winds upwards from the valley, until it joins the masses of frost from which it was produced above, winding through its own ravine like a bright belt flung over the black region of pines. There is more in all these scenes than mere magnitude of proportion. There is a majesty of outline. There is an awful grace in the very colors which invest these wonderful shapes, a charm which is peculiar to them, quite distinct even from the reality of their unutterable greatness. 156, July 24. Yesterday morning we went to the source of the Arveren. It is about a league from this village. The river rolls forth impetuously from an arch of ice, and spreads itself in many streams over a vast space of the valley, ravaged and laid bare by its inundations. The glacier by which its waters are nourished overhangs this cavern and the plain, and the forests of pine which surround it, with terrible precipices of solid ice. On the other side rises the immense glacier of Montenvert, 50 miles in extent, occupying a chasm among mountains of inconceivable height, and a form so pointed and abrupt that they seemed to pierce the sky. From this glacier 157, we saw as we sat on a rock, close to one of the streams of the Arveren, masses of ice detach themselves from on high, and rush with a loud, dull noise into the vale. The violence of their fall turned them into powder, which flowed over the rocks in imitation of waterfalls, whose ravines they usurped and filled.